Imagine being unfairly judged for who you are, only to turn the tables with an act of pure kindness. This is the story of a young man who saved the life of someone who hated him, leaving everyone stunned and changed forever. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. The park buzzed with life on a warm afternoon. Children laughed as they chased each other across the grassy fields. Joggers kept pace along the winding paths, and dog walkers stopped to chat while their pets explored every scent the park had to offer. Amid this lively scene, James Carter walked in an unhurried pace, a small backpack slung over one shoulder. The 20-year-old had just finished a long day volunteering at the community center, helping with the food drive that had drawn a bigger crowd than expected. His steps were heavy with fatigue, but his heart carried the quiet satisfaction of a day spent helping others. James barely noticed the middle-aged woman on a nearby bench as he passed. Margaret Whitman, however, noticed him immediately. Her sharp eyes narrowed at the sight of him. To Margaret, James was an unwelcome anomaly in this neighborhood park, a place she believed should be reserved for people she deemed appropriate. Her gaze lingered on his casual clothes and the slight sag of his backpack, her thoughts jumping to conclusions as quickly as her lips began to purse in disapproval. She stood abruptly, brushing invisible dust from her pristine pantsuit. With a pointed stride, Margaret intercepted James on the path. He stopped, startled by the abruptness of her approach. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her voice cutting through the chatter of the park. "Can I help you with something? You seem out of place here." James blinked, taken aback by the hostility in her tone. "I'm just walking home," he replied, his voice steady but polite. Margaret crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "Home? Around here?" "I doubt that," she said, her words dripping with suspicion. "You don't exactly look like you belong in this neighborhood." A few heads turned in their direction as Margaret's voice rose. James could feel the weight of the glances, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. He inhaled deeply, willing himself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time he had faced something like this. "I volunteer at the community center," James said evenly, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of openness. "I'm just passing through on my way home." Margaret scoffed. "The community center? Is that supposed to explain why you're loitering here? People like you don't just pass through. You're up to something, I can tell." James felt his stomach twist, but he didn't let the frustration show on his face. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said. "I don't know what you think I'm doing, but I promise I'm just walking home." Margaret wasn't satisfied. Her voice grew louder, enough to draw the attention of more park-goers. "Scaring people like this? Wandering around like you own the place? Do you know how many people feel unsafe when they see someone like you hanging around? Maybe I should call the police." The words stung, though James maintained his composure. His hands tightened around the straps of his backpack as he stood his ground. "I'm not trying to scare anyone," he said. "I'm just trying to get home." Margaret shook her head, her hand already reaching for her phone. "I don't think this park is the place for you." The tension in the air was thick, the hum of the park seeming to dim around them. James could feel the stares of strangers, some curious, others judgmental, but none willing to step in. He swallowed the lump in his throat, knowing that anything more than calm words could escalate the situation beyond control. Still, Margaret's words were cutting deeper than she could ever know. He stood rooted, refusing to let her push him further. Margaret's tirade was interrupted by her own sharp gasp as her foot caught on the uneven pavement, sending her tumbling backward. Her phone clattered to the ground as she landed hard, her ankle twisting painfully. She cried out, the haughty anger replaced by sudden vulnerability. The onlookers froze, unsure of how to react. James didn't hesitate. He dropped his backpack and knelt beside her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. Margaret looked up at him, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. "What are you doing?" she snapped, wincing as she tried to sit up. "Helping," James said simply. He glanced at her swollen ankle, already assessing the situation. "It looks like you've twisted your ankle. Do you think you can stand?" Margaret stared at him, her indignation flickering as pain overtook her. She muttered something under her breath, but James didn't press her for a response. Instead, he carefully helped her sit up, his actions calm and deliberate, despite the crowd that continued to watch. The hostility in Margaret's eyes dimmed, replaced by something almost resembling uncertainty. She allowed herself to lean on James's arm as he steadied her. For the first time that afternoon, she seemed at a loss for words. The confrontation had taken an unexpected turn, and the audience now watched not with judgment, but with a growing sense of respect for the young man who had shown grace under fire. Margaret's confrontation with James is rooted in a judgment based solely on his appearance, reflecting a harsh reality many face daily. Her immediate assumptions about James, fueled by biases and stereotypes, mirror the societal issue of jumping to conclusions based on superficial characteristics like race and attire. The encounter serves as a microcosm of the broader challenges surrounding implicit bias and prejudice in everyday interactions. As the story unfolds, Margaret's harsh demeanor begins to crack under the weight of her own actions and James's unwavering grace. Her transformation from hostility to gratitude reflects a powerful journey of redemption. When she realizes the kindness James has shown her, despite her earlier behavior, Margaret is forced to confront her own prejudices and reevaluate her actions. This transformation is a testament to the power of forgiveness and the human capacity for growth. Viewers connect deeply with this theme of change as it resonates with the universal hope for second chances. Margaret's journey from judgment to understanding encourages introspection, inviting the audience to reflect on their own biases and the potential for growth when they choose empathy over prejudice. The park was alive with energy, a tapestry of chatter and laughter filling the air as people enjoyed the sunny afternoon. Children darted across the grassy fields, their carefree giggles echoing among the trees. Joggers passed by with steady determination, and families gathered for picnics under the shade of sprawling oaks. In this vibrant scene, James Carter strolled quietly, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The young man, barely out of his teens, carried himself with an understated confidence, a product of countless hours spent volunteering at the local community center. On the opposite side of the park, Margaret Whitman sat rigidly on a bench, her sharp gaze scanning the surroundings. Her posture was that of someone who carried a sense of authority, or at least believed she did. When her eyes landed on James, something shifted. Her expression hardened, and her fingers tightened around the handle of her leather handbag. She watched him for a moment, her thoughts running wild with assumptions. Margaret rose abruptly, her heels clicking against the pavement as she strode toward James. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the park's lively noise as she called out, "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" James slowed his steps, turning to face her with a mix of surprise and caution. Just walking home?" he replied calmly, unsure of why he was being stopped. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Home? Around here? I don't think so. This isn't exactly your kind of neighborhood. Her tone was laced with disdain, her words a blatant accusation wrapped in thinly veiled hostility. James exhaled, his patience already being tested. I volunteered at the community center, he explained evenly. I was helping with the food drive earlier. Now I'm just heading back. Margaret scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. Volunteering, huh? That's a convenient excuse. People like you always have some kind of story. She gestured vaguely toward him, as if his very presence was offensive. James's jaw tightened, but he refused to let his frustration show. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said, his voice steady. I'm just passing through. Margaret wasn't convinced. Her voice rose, drawing the attention of passers-by. Scaring people in the park isn't passing through. You're lucky I don't call the police right now. A ripple of tension spread through the nearby crowd as heads turned toward the unfolding scene. James stood his ground, his posture calm yet firm. He knew that anything more than measured words could escalate the situation in ways he didn't want to imagine. Before James could respond, Margaret took a step back, her heel catching on the edge of a loose paving stone. The movement was sudden and jerky, and she lost her balance. A sharp cry escaped her lips as she tumbled backward, landing hard on the ground. The crowd froze for a split second, before murmurs of concern rippled through the onlookers. James was the first to act. Dropping his backpack, he rushed to Margaret's side. Her face was contorted in pain as she clutched her ankle, which had twisted at an awkward angle. Her knee bore a nasty scrape, blood already trickling down her pale skin. Don't move, James said firmly, his tone steady but gentle. He crouched beside her, assessing the injuries with the practiced eye of someone who had seen his fair share of emergencies. Margaret flinched as he reached for her ankle, but he met her eyes with a calm expression. I'm going to help you. Margaret's indignation wavered, replaced by a mix of pain and confusion. Why would you? She began. Someone call an ambulance, he called out to the crowd. A young woman nodded and pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed. James turned his attention back to Margaret. It's just a sprain, but you'll need a doctor to look at it, he said, his voice calm and reassuring. Margaret winced but said nothing. The sharpness in her demeanor was gone, replaced by a vulnerability she seemed unaccustomed to showing. She glanced around at the gathering crowd, her face flushing with embarrassment. Let's get you off the pavement, James suggested. With the help of another bystander, he carefully lifted Margaret onto a nearby bench. He crouched again, pulling a small first aid kit from his backpack and disinfecting the scrape on her knee. You carry a first aid kit? Margaret asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. James glanced up briefly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Always. You never know when you might need it. Margaret's lips parted as if to say something, but she closed them again, her expression conflicted. The young man she had berated moments ago was now the one tending to her injuries with a level of care and professionalism she hadn't expected. The ambulance arrived within minutes, its flashing lights reflecting off the park's trees. As the paramedics took over, one of them clapped James on the shoulder. Nice work stabilizing her. You've done this before. James nodded. A few times. I've had some training. Margaret watched silently as the paramedics worked, her earlier anger now overshadowed by something else entirely. For the first time, she truly saw James not as a stereotype, but as a young man who had chosen compassion over resentment. Her assumptions about him began to crack. the weight of her actions pressing heavily on her chest. As the paramedics prepared to take Margaret to the hospital, she turned to James. Her voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting his. James nodded, his expression kind but unreadable. "Take care of yourself," he said simply, before stepping back to let the paramedics do their work. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving James to gather his backpack and continue his walk home. His shoulders were tense, but his stride was steady. He didn't need to say it, but his actions had spoken volume, about who he was and about the power of choosing grace in the face of hostility. James stood quietly by Margaret's side as they waited for the ambulance to arrive. The tension between them was palpable, but his demeanor remained calm and composed. Margaret, still reeling from the fall and her mounting embarrassment, struggled to meet his gaze. Her pride made it difficult to reconcile her earlier hostility with his unexpected kindness. She glanced at him briefly, then looked away, her voice uncertain. "Why are you even helping me after what I said? You could have just walked away." James crouched down to check the makeshift support he had created for her ankle. His expression was thoughtful as he replied, "Because it's the right thing to do. Everyone deserves help when they need it." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The simplicity of his answer disarmed her. Her mind raced with thoughts, trying to process how the young man she had insulted moments ago could show her such kindness. The wail of sirens broke the silence, and moments later, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed over, carefully assessing Margaret's injuries before placing her on a stretcher. James provided them with a clear account of what had happened, his tone calm and professional. His level of composure caught the attention of the paramedics, one of whom asked, "Are you in emergency services?" James shook his head modestly. "I work at the community center. We train for situations like this." The paramedic nodded in approval. "You've got a good head on your shoulders. Nice work." As the paramedics wheeled Margaret toward the ambulance, she hesitated, glancing back at James. "Thank you," she said softly, the sincerity in her voice breaking through her pride. James offered her a small smile. "Take care of yourself." Instead of leaving, James followed the ambulance to the hospital. He felt a sense of responsibility to ensure Margaret was cared for, even if she hadn't treated him kindly. At the hospital, he stayed in the waiting room, giving the staff space to do their work. When the doctors informed Margaret that her injuries were minor but required rest, she asked for James. Seeing him approach her bedside, she felt a wave of conflicting emotions: gratitude, guilt, and unease. "You didn't have to stay," she said, her tone quieter now. James shrugged slightly. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Margaret hesitated, struggling with her words. James nodded, not pressing her further. "Get some rest," he said, before leaving the room. He didn't want to linger, sensing that she needed time to process everything that had happened. Later that evening, as Margaret lay in her hospital bed, a nurse came in to check on her. The nurse, a friendly woman with a warm smile, began chatting casually. "You're lucky that young man was there to help you," she said. "James is one of the best." Margaret frowned slightly, curiosity piqued. "You know him?" The nurse nodded. "Oh, everyone around here knows James. He's the head of emergency response at the community center. He's trained hundreds of people in first aid, saved lives during floods, and even helped during a fire at one of the housing complexes last year." Margaret's eyes widened. "Wait, the fire at Maplewood Apartments? My friend Susan lives there. She mentioned a young man who helped get her and her kids out safely." "That was James," the nurse confirmed with a smile. "He's dedicated to this community. It's people like him who remind us that there's still a lot of good in the world." Margaret was stunned. Her mind replayed the events of the day, juxtaposed with this new information. The young man she had dismissed and insulted had likely saved the lives of people she cared about, and he had shown her nothing but compassion despite her behavior. As the nurse left, Margaret stared at the ceiling, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. How could she have been so blind? Her assumptions had clouded her judgment, and her pride had made her unable to see James for who he truly was, a kind, capable, and selfless individual. She thought of the times she had spoken ill of people she didn't know, using stereotypes and assumptions to justify her prejudice. For the first time, Margaret felt the full sting of guilt and shame. She realized that she had allowed her biases to dictate her interactions, and in doing so, she had almost missed the chance to recognize James's humanity. The hospital room was quiet, but Margaret's mind was anything but. She resolved to make amends, not just to James, but also to herself. She knew that change wouldn't come easily, but it had to start somewhere, and for her, it would start with acknowledging the truth and taking responsibility for her actions. Margaret sat in her car, the engine idling as she stared at the community center. She clutched the steering wheel, unsure if she had the courage to step inside. The past few days had been a whirlwind of reflection, and her guilt weighed heavily on her. She replayed her encounter with James over and over, each time feeling a deeper sense of regret. Today, she had resolved to do what she should have done long ago: apologize. Taking a deep breath, Margaret stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The sound of children laughing and the sight of volunteers bustling about greeted her as she entered the community center. Her heart raced as she approached the front desk, where a young volunteer directed her to James's office. When she reached the doorway, she saw James sitting at his desk, engrossed in a stack of papers. She knocked softly, and he looked up, his expression shifting to one of mild surprise. "Margaret," he said, standing up, "what brings you here?" She hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. "James, I came to apologize," she began, her voice trembling. "I was wrong. So wrong. To judge you the way I did, my assumptions, my words, they were unfair and hurtful. I'm truly sorry." James regarded her for a moment, his face calm and unreadable. Then he gestured to a chair across from him. "Please, have a seat." Margaret sat down, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. James leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "I appreciate you coming here to say that," he said. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." She nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I realize how blinded I've been by my own biases. Learning about all the good you've done for this community, it opened my eyes. I misjudged you in every way possible." James smiled faintly. "Margaret, I've faced prejudice all my life. It's not easy, but I've learned that responding with kindness is the only way to break the cycle. It's not about letting people off the hook, it's about showing them a better way forward." Margaret listened intently, her admiration for James growing with every word. "You've taught me more in a single encounter than I've learned in years," she admitted. "I want to do better. I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." James nodded. "It's never too late to change. The fact that you're here, taking responsibility, speaks volumes." They talked for a while longer, their conversation flowing with honesty and mutual understanding. Margaret shared how her upbringing and past experiences had shaped her views, while James spoke about the challenges he had faced and the resilience he had built in response. As their conversation wound down, Margaret made a decision. "I want to volunteer here," she said. "I want to contribute, to learn, and to help in any way I can." James's face lit up with a genuine smile. "We'd be glad to have you," he said. "There's always room for more hands and more hearts." Over the weeks that followed, Margaret became a regular presence at the community center. She worked alongside James, assisting with programs for children, organizing events, and learning about the diverse lives and stories of the people she had once dismissed. The experience was humbling and transformative, allowing her to confront her biases head-on and replace them with empathy and understanding. One day, Margaret joined James at a community event celebrating local heroes. As they stood together, she watched as James was recognized for his tireless efforts and the countless lives he had touched. The crowd erupted into applause, and Margaret couldn't help but smile, her heart swelling with pride for the man she had once misjudged. Later, as they sat together, Margaret turned to James. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for your patience, your kindness, and for giving me the chance to change." James looked at her, his expression warm. "Thank you, Margaret, for choosing to see beyond the surface and for making a difference." The event ended with laughter, music, and a sense of unity that filled the air. Margaret felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the opportunity to atone for her mistakes, but for the friendship she had found in James. The experience had changed her, and she knew she would carry its lessons with her for the rest of her life. As they left the event, Margaret glanced back at the community center, a place that had become a symbol of hope and transformation for her. Walking alongside James, she felt lighter, as though she had shed the weight of her past prejudices and stepped into a brighter, more compassionate future. The emotional appeal of this story lies in its powerful blend of resilience, redemption, and inspiration. James's unwavering composure in the face of prejudice immediately draws empathy from viewers. His ability to remain kind and helpful, even when treated unfairly, showcases a rare strength of character that resonates deeply with anyone who has faced discrimination. Margaret's journey from antagonist to ally adds a layer of relatability, as her transformation mirrors the internal struggle many experience when confronting their own biases. Her willingness to admit her mistakes and take actionable steps toward change highlights the power of self-awareness and growth. Finally, James's decision to turn a hurtful experience into an opportunity for education and unity serves as a beacon of inspiration. His example challenges viewers to rise above negativity, fostering a message of hope, kindness, and the importance of seeing humanity in everyone. This emotional trifecta ensures the story stays with the audience, motivating them to reflect on their own actions and attitudes. James Carter is a calm and kind-hearted community leader who embodies resilience and compassion. His quiet strength shines through as he faces adversity with grace, inspiring others by leading through action rather than words. James's actions highlight his unwavering belief in kindness and his ability to rise above prejudice, making him a compelling figure who resonates deeply with the audience. Margaret Whitman begins as a judgmental and biased individual, her initial hostility reflecting common societal prejudices. Her journey, however, is one of growth and transformation. Confronted with her misconceptions, Margaret evolves from an antagonist into an ally, showing that change is possible when one is willing to confront and overcome their biases. Her character arc serves as a reminder that everyone is capable of growth. The onlookers in the park act as a mirror of society, their reactions reflecting the mix of indifference and curiosity often present in such situations. They add realism to the narrative, emphasizing how public incidents unfold. The medical staff play a pivotal role in shifting Margaret's perspective, their revelation of James's heroic background acting as a turning point that challenges her assumptions and fosters understanding. These characters together create a powerful narrative of prejudice, forgiveness, and redemption, making the story deeply relatable and emotionally resonant. Their interactions and growth underscore the importance of empathy and the transformative power of understanding. Have you ever been part of or witnessed a moment where kindness shattered prejudice and brought people together? Share your experience in the comments and inspire others with your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to join us for more powerful and transformative tales. Power Wealth or a high rank may give you a sense of superiority for a moment, but remember, the day always comes when you're held accountable for your actions. Racism, belittling communities, or disrespecting others based on religion may seem unnoticed now, but justice has a way of finding its mark. Respect is not just about others, it defines who you truly are. Think about it. What will your legacy be? Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories.